Man, madakpan yo.
Yan.
Man.
Bigas.
Ben, nasa ulan eh. Nako, jeep diha, di po maluon.
How's it going? I got you some banana cake. It's very nice banana cake.
What?
Banana cake.
Where is the bot this one?
I will walk down. I like walking around.
The response is better, but not enough.
Well, you road tested it?
Yeah.
I don't think the gas here is much good, eh? I don't think the gas here is very good. Was it 91?
The 95 here is the red.
Yeah, but you can't put 95 in this.
Yeah, looks better.
You can put 95 in?
Because this one is 250cc.
Oh, it says. But I can put 95 in here. I'll do that. That will help.
Because 95% it has little bit oil, so that it can be cooler now engine.
Yeah.
Because in the big bike is the required is 100 above.
Yeah, I know, because my Suzuki in Ukraine was 100. I used to put 100 in. But in your in the book, the little book, it says 91.
This one.
In the handbook, it says
Handbook.
91. So anyway, to put 95 in,
You try to put 95.
I would do it.
Let's see. Oh, wait.
As long as it doesn't dab into the engine.
Yeah.
No, in Ukraine, my 650, I used to run it on 100 plus.
Yeah. Because if you put 90 below, damage the engine. It produces heat so much. You have an appointment today?
Oh, I want to go tomorrow. I want to go down to Santa Catalina, but
Which way? This one? Which way?
Santa
You go.
Catalina, South Negros.
South Negros?
It's a nice ride.
And then Santa Catalina to back to Dumaguete.
Yeah, I have friends there. I'm going to go visit friends, but I often go up the 7-Eleven, which is up